When we started our work at OCCRP, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, we were investigating story after story, organized crime after organized crime. At some point I was asking myself, what's going on here? We're investigating the same thing over and over again. It was the same. It was always the bank, the offshore, the money laundering, the crimes. When I realized we have to do something a little bit different. Rather than going case by case to investigate organized crime, we need to understand, why is it so similar? Why are crimes so similar, and why the system that enables the crime is always the same?
Paul Radu is one of the founders of the OCCRP, a group of investigative journalists dedicated to fighting the corruption and white-collar crime of mafia organizations. Born in Romania under Ceausescu, he witnessed the collapse of the Eastern Bloc and the subsequent transformation of state socialism into a mafia-style capitalism firsthand. With the collapse of political boundaries, the world was transformed into a crime-ridden supercontinent. It was a new era of covert violence, an era in which banks would play a major role.
And to understand what was going on, you have to go back a little bit in time, to the 80s, to the 70s, and to look at the price of money laundering. How costly money laundering was for criminal groups.
This story examines a bygone world in the heart of a country that no longer exists, the Soviet Union. The homeland of socialism and a haven for workers from all over the world, the USSR aspired to represent a new form of historical progress. Its vast territory and unrivaled natural resources seemed to promise an eternal and glorious future. But the realities of the Soviet state's power were more complex. Behind the state apparatus was the Communist Party, and behind the Communist Party lay the real masters of the USSR, the sword and shield of the Soviet world, the secret services and the political police, the KGB. By the early 1980s, the more astute members of the KGB realized that the Soviet bloc could no longer compete with the West. The system's collapse was not out of the question. To guarantee their own survival, the KGB set up a vast operation to extract Soviet resources through shell companies, originally used as cover for destabilization operations and industrial espionage.
The idea was to recycle this accumulation of shell companies with no real economic activity to enable the assets of the Communist Party and the KGB to be transferred abroad.
The plundering began. Aluminum, copper, steel, and titanium, bought in the USSR at Soviet prices, were sold in the West at the much higher world market price. The surplus was recovered by a chain of shell companies that then invested the money outside the USSR. A small, sunny country, far from the icy Soviet Union, had been rolling out its red carpet for a long time. The island of Cyprus.
Cyprus, to the former Soviet Union, Cyprus was one of the main investment vehicles. They literally saw the island as a huge shopping mall for offshores.
Split in two since the 1974 Greek-Turkish War, the Greek part of Cyprus is an outpost of the West, which joined the European Union, and later the Eurozone in 2004.
It came down to a few law firms that were again very happy to receive Russian, Kazakhs and Tajikistanis and Ukrainian corrupt business, everybody from the former Soviet Union who had a bit of dirty money. There would not be any question asked in Cyprus if you wanted to open up an offshores, if you wanted to do business, to open up bank accounts and so on and so on. So Cyprus was literally that enabling place, a whole island that was put in the service of criminals and corrupt politicians for a very, very long time.
To conceal its operations, the KGB employed businessmen born in the USSR who had emigrated to the West. In Soviet intelligence terminology, these men were managing partners and their companies friendly firms. Among these traders was Boris Birstein, trained at the Foreign Ministry in Moscow and dispatched to the other side of the Iron Curtain.
Boris Birstein.
Boris Birstein, who was he? He was a Lithuanian born in the 40s who began his international career in the 70s. He first set up a company called Sibeco, which had a base in Hong Kong, but which was backed by a head office in Switzerland. These were small companies all over Canada and Western Europe. And with this company, he was able to invest funds in banks and in the equity of companies, this sort of thing. What is interesting about Boris Birstein is that he wasn't just a businessman who was involved in trading and then all of a sudden looked after the interests of the KGB. He was also caught up in the criminal underworld.
Russian organized crime was officially non-existent in the socialist paradise. The vorvi zakoni, thieves in law, those tattooed men with their sanguinary stories, were sent to the gulag or broken down in penal colonies. Yet the underworld survived, maintaining a long history with the KGB.
Organized crime was never eliminated totally during the Stalin era. Many of the criminals went to labor camps, and there they dominated the political prisoners. So they were a force in the labor camps, and they stayed a force in Russian society. There were songs about them. They were colorful characters. They were called vori v zakonie, thieves in law, because they had their own legal code. So they were from the Caucasus, they were from Central Asia, and they were very, very involved in different types of organized crime. Racketeering, extortion, the second economy.
In a country where a command economy meant collective farms, state companies, and constant scarcity, factories and businesses operated thanks to a parallel economy, the black market, which led to widespread corruption. The Vori chiefs, recruited by the KGB, enforced control of society through violence and took control of the huge underground market that kept the USSR from collapsing for a while.
In the last 5 years of the Soviet period, the economy or the state budget was dependent on the sale of alcohol. And that money, instead of going to the state, went to organized crime. And at the same time that organized crime was just making massive amounts of money by producing illegal alcohol, Russia or the Soviet Union began to privatize the economy. And so they were sitting on huge amounts of cash.
At the end of the 1980s, the perestroika, initiated by Mikhail Gorbachev, unleashed production and attempted to reestablish some semblance of economic efficiency. Gorbachev wanted to reopen the country, but despite his best efforts, he opened Pandora's box. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet bloc crumbled. In Moscow, less than 2 years later, in August 1991, an attempted coup by the regime's hardliners failed, marking the end of the USSR. Inheriting a shrinking Russia on the brink of ruin, Boris Yeltsin ordered investigations into the country's greatest secret, its finances. The investigations would be difficult. A lot of archives had disappeared, and 3 of the Communist Party's main financial managers had the misfortune of falling from windows. The Yeltsin era marked the end of 70 years of political repression and collectivism. In Moscow's Lubyanka Square, the statue of Felix Dzerzhinsky, the founder of the Cheka, the forerunner of the KGB, was taken down. The KGB was dissolved and replaced by the FSB, an organization with a diminished role.
À partir du moment
When the USSR collapsed in 1991, it was a vital moment because everyone in the game, small businessmen and big businessmen alike, understood that since the traditional law enforcement agencies no longer existed, they would be replaced by someone else. This is exactly where organized crime would play a very special role, namely by saying, we are order, we are the true protectors against economic tyranny. Do you own anything? Okay, you pay us, we protect you, and we guarantee that you remain the owner of your company.
A new economic era began, marked by the meteoric rise of a new class of entrepreneurs, the oligarchs, led by Mikhail Khodorkovsky and Boris Berezovsky. Masters of economic predation, the oligarchs made a pact with the only remaining power in the country.
From the inception of the post-Soviet economy, you had the new financial leaders of the economy working hand in glove with organized crime.
Il suffit qu'un groupe
All it took was for a group to come in with guns blazing, take over the accounts department, rip up the share register, and you no longer owned anything. Most of the world's steel changed hands in one morning.
en une matinée.
In the Russian aluminum industry, 47 people were murdered.
On prend des Kalachnikovs et on prend
They
le
took
contrôle
Kalashnikovs and seized control of the big coal mines.
contrôle du cuivre.
They seized control of the copper mines, but they did so in such a way that they owned percentages, sometimes even tens of percentages, of the world's resources in some of these sectors.
Certaines de ces filières.
And they created their own bank and their own network of influence. And less than a decade later, they found themselves listed on the London Stock Exchange.
Coté à la Bourse de Londres.
It is from a former Soviet republic that the world of crime would be reorganized. In 1993, in Yerevan, the capital of Armenia, a huge crowd accompanied Rafik Svo, the great godfather of the Armenian Mafia, on his last journey. The funeral was attended by Soviet wise men from various countries of the former USSR, the United States, Germany, and Turkey, as well as Italian mafiosi and Colombian drug traffickers who were also invited for the occasion. During the ceremony, the Mafia held a historic meeting. The time had come to create a new international criminal organization to keep up with the changing globalized world, where the circulation, investment, and laundering of money needed to be rethought. At the same time, criminal summits were held in Tel Aviv and Puerto Rico to discuss international investments by mafiosi from the former Soviet Union.
Lorsque l'URSS s'effondre, il y a
When the
deux
USSR
mouvements
collapsed,
vers l'étranger.
there
Il y a
were two
d'abord,
movements
on en
abroad.
parlait, un mouvement
First of all,
organisé
as we've
qui était
talked about,
pensé par le KGB,
there was an organized
qui est
movement
basé sur
designed
ces
by the
sociétés à
KGB
l'étranger.
and based on
Mais il y
these
a
companies abroad.
d'autres mouvements
But there were
qui vont
also
avoir
other
de manière
movements,
isolée,
which,
ou
either in
parce qu'elles sont
isolation or
portées par
because they
un
were
groupe
supported by criminal groups,
qu'il faut
felt that it was
effectivement
necessary
sortir
to leave the former
de
USSR
l'ex-URSS
and
et prendre son
expand.
expansion.
I remember going I think it was in 1993, to a closed government conference in the Washington area. And there was somebody from Scotland Yard who got up and said, you know, we have all these professors and mathematicians staying at our top hotels in London. These are Russian mathematicians, Russian statisticians. We don't understand what they're doing here. But we think that they're doing something with money from Russia. They move their money out of Russia into England, into the south of France, into Spain, into the United States, where there is rule of law. It's not that they built rule of law within their own country. They went out to find rule of law elsewhere.
In Brooklyn, in the south of New York, the Russian mafia, made up of Vori bosses and former KGB members, were getting into business with the big Italian-American families and bringing their expertise in financial crime with them, namely money laundering and the infiltration of banking systems. The United States, the great victor of the Cold War, failed to see the emergence of this threat, the culmination of these new alliances. Convinced of its omnipotence, America accelerated the globalization of its economy. In 1993, U.S. President Bill Clinton set up NAFTA, a vast free trade area between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. NAFTA was a gift to organized crime in Mexico. The opening of border crossings is accompanied by another major change. Since the death of Pablo Escobar in Colombia, the Mexican cartels had taken control of the huge cocaine market.
Mexican organized crime wasn't born with a cocaine trade. They already had these smuggling networks in place to move people, to move heroin, to move marijuana. The cocaine trade is so lucrative and moves such scale that they very quickly developed their own infrastructure. And then the Mexicans become the senior partners for the US market, which is the case today.
The free trade agreement expedited border crossings, with an endless stream of trucks dumping clothes, toys, and television sets into the United States, along with cannabis, heroin, and cocaine. Drug money traveled in the opposite direction. In Mexico, one bank in particular stood out for its ability to launder this money, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, HSBC.
The couriers were carrying in Samsonites in duffel bags full of $100 bills, fresh off the streets of Los Angeles and Seattle and Chicago. The drug couriers frequently wearing leather jackets with the symbol of the Sinaloa drug cartel or the Los Zetas drug cartel on their back. Okay, so they're like pretty obvious. They have like a little badge, like I'm a Sinaloa member, don't fuck with me. Okay, so they'd show up at the bank. The bank built special windows so they could raise the window and you could just shove the duffel bags of cash under it. And how did we know that? Because we had surveillance cameras inside HSBC Mexico City's headquarters, okay, all over. We had them all over the place in there.
After years of investigations, the U.S. justice system succeeded in convicting HSBC, which paid a fine of almost $2 billion. A slap on the wrist for a banking group of this size.
HSBC is a notorious serial violator on kind of a scale of Credit Suisse when it comes to financial crimes. And here's another example where they didn't lose their license. Nobody went to jail. It was basically a non-penalty penalty and, a technical foul. I don't think until we take these big banks to the cleaners and basically make an exhibit of one of them, at least, that we will be able to get rid of this behavior.
Unsurprisingly, HSBC kept its banking license. However, the Mexican cartels were obliged to rethink their money laundering system.
We've seen Mexican cartels in the US that came out from an FBI leaked document set up private investment accounts, essentially into the investment markets, and then take that money out to buy gold.
At the same time, to the north of the American continent, in Canada, another mafia system was setting up its own money laundering mechanisms, the Chinese triads. Since the 1980s, cocaine and heroin have flooded the country from Vancouver, the fourth largest port in the Americas. In the evenings, Vancouver's city center was the stage for gruesome scenes.
Just the volume of open-air drug market activity, the violence in the area, the disproportionate number of First Nations and Indigenous people that gravitated towards this open-air drug market in downtown Vancouver, it was hard to look at and watch.
In Canada's major cities, Toronto, Ottawa, and Vancouver, the triads divided up the drug market. These mafia groups were all the more invisible because they formed part of a diaspora that had been present in Canada for over a century. In Vancouver, the triads were laundering and reinvesting crime money using the same tried and tested model as two colonial enclaves, Macau and Hong Kong. Over the decades, the triads had built a vast empire of prostitution, drug trafficking, gambling, and illegal betting. In Macau, a huge casino park was used by Chinese Communist Party apparatchiks to squander and hide their fortunes, and by the triads to launder their dirty money. This is the model that Macau organized crime was exporting to Canada. The triads succeeded in infiltrating the vast world of casinos in the province of Vancouver, British Columbia.
Government casino workers saw figures such as Betty Big Sister Yan, Kwok Chun Tam, Lai Cheng-sing, China's most wanted fugitive. These were the high rollers, the loan sharks that employees in the casino saw had such influence, carried such amounts of cash, generated such profits that they became the de facto bosses of the casino.
The casino, through the use of tokens, creates a parallel economy. When you have multiple casinos spread across an entire territory, you can have tokens worth 100,000, 1 million, 2 million, 5 million, 100 million. It's worth that kind of money. But they're tiny and made of plastic. It's great for money laundering or for transferring money, because you can take a token from Moscow, for example, and then change it in Vienna. You can take a token from Shanghai and change it in Hong Kong, and vice versa. And then it became international because you could pay with these things, which are completely outside any kind of financial regulation.
On the American continent, drugs, money laundering circuits, and a host of criminal players combined to create a new criminal superhighway from Tijuana to Vancouver, at a time when Macau and then Hong Kong were falling back into the hands of China. In Europe, another mafia group was about to throw their hat into the global crime arena. the 'Ndrangheta. Based in Calabria, in southern Italy, the criminal organization of rural origin is one of the country's 4 historic mafias. Unlike the Sicilians of Cosa Nostra, or the Neapolitans of the Camorra, or the 4th Mafia of Apulia, the 'Ndrangheta was the only mafia present on every continent, and this expansion enabled it to understand what the fall of the Berlin Wall meant before anyone else.
The 'Ndrangheta understood that there were no longer any barriers between West and East. There was no longer a Cold War, no longer 2 opposing blocs, but the world to conquer. So we're talking about the colonization of markets in South Africa, in the Congo, in Kenya, in Eastern Europe, in South America.
Based in the United States for over a century, the 'Ndrangheta then deployed its men in Colombia, Peru, and Brazil. By the early 1990s, they had become the world's leading exporter of cocaine, managing entry points in Europe, Africa, and Oceania.
And the 'Ndrangheta, which has considerable financial resources at its disposal, found an extraordinary ally in the unregulated capitalism. Because drug money entered the legal economy with impressive ease. Today, there isn't a country in Europe where the 'Ndrangheta hasn't managed to invest money.
The 'Ndrangheta invested in various sectors: services, restaurants, real estate, construction, supermarkets, and transport. They diversified their investments wherever they set up shop, consolidating their links with criminal organizations in Russia, China, Turkey, Morocco, Nigeria, and Albania. Over the years, this rural mafia has become a criminal multinational, investing all over the world, except in Calabria. Luigi Bonaventura is a repentant member of the 'Ndrangheta, who left the organization at the risk of his life.
The real problem lay not just in how to obtain and distribute cocaine, but also how to launder the money. Today, the price of cocaine may seem very high, but we mustn't forget that if I buy coke here in Italy at $10,000 a kilo and sell it for 35 or 40,000, in all this, you have to factor in the losses associated with tax to recycle and launder the money. Money laundering even works in such a way that the drug trafficker becomes the one who pays the most tax, because you automatically have restaurants, hotels. The 'Ndranghetists swarmed entire states and bought up everything and anything. There have been towns where people have said to us, "Stop buying, you've bought everything." So the 'Ndrangheta is a phenomenon that goes beyond Italy's borders. To identify it solely as an Italian problem would be really restrictive and dangerous, very dangerous.
In a telephone conversation intercepted by the Italian police, one 'Ndrangheta declared that the world is divided in 2, Calabria and what will one day become Calabria. In Russia, the young Federation had barely emerged from a state of limbo and already appeared to be on the verge of collapse. Most of its resources were in the hands of predators. The banking system was on the verge of becoming overrun by the mafia. Recalcitrant bankers were being murdered. In 1995, the Central Bank of Russia estimated that between 50 and 80% of the country's banks were in the hands of organized crime.
The money flights were enormous, and the economic situation of the ordinary citizen was extremely precarious. But because if you owned a bank, and you raided the bank and sent the money overseas, the bank depositors lost their assets. And so this impoverished the Russian population over and over again with these banking scandals, which is part of the reason that people wanted stability, because they'd lost stability and the support of the social welfare benefits that existed in the Soviet period. Then they lost their life savings in the banks. And so everything seemed to be collapsing around them. And you could see the rise of oligarchs, you could see gangsters in the restaurants, in expensive cars, in the streets, and this was just traumatic.
One man symbolized the immense power enjoyed by Russian criminal groups at the time, Sergei Mikhailov, the leader of the Moscow Solntseevskaya, then the most powerful mafia organization in Russia. Mikhailov recycled the income from Solntseevskaya's criminal and banking activities through a myriad of shell companies with offshore accounts. In 1996, Mikhailov was arrested in Geneva, where he lived, for money laundering.
Swiss investigators discovered this on Swiss territory. They started issuing letters of request abroad. They went to Western Europe, and what did they find? They found links to Boris Berstein and companies linked to the Solntseevskaya organized crime group. So pure organized crime. This is where we were left puzzled, saying to ourselves, but what are we talking about in this web of Russian organized crime, where they had such close ties with mafia bosses, businessmen, and KGB intermediaries?
This was the secret of the Russian mafia's power. The underground networks of the former KGB and the positions acquired in the West thanks to the network of front companies. Ousted from the Kremlin by the Yeltsin clan, the former KGB disappeared from Moscow. Their vengeance would come in the country's second city, St. Petersburg. In the mid-1990s, in an atmosphere of extreme violence, the Tambov mafia group took control of the port facilities and turned them into a hub for cocaine trafficking. To launder their money, the mafia acquired a stake in Russia, a small regional bank set up by former KGB officers.
Bank Russia is a very good example. This was one of those banks, and there were a few in Russia that were acting kind of in the same vein to enable politicians to launder money and to amass a large part of the loot. So this is a bank that kind of sits at the center of crime and politics, the pivot that allowed people to shuffle money around and to gain control, financial control, which is crucial, to political control.
Major shareholders in Bank Russia, the St. Petersburg Mafia also benefited from the diligent help of the city's deputy mayor. The man who kept such a low profile that he was invisible in official photos was none other than former KGB officer Vladimir Putin. Stationed in Dresden in the 1980s, Putin took part in destabilization operations on behalf of the KGB and the Stasi, the East German Secret Service, as well as smuggling technology from the West. At the end of 1999, Putin succeeded Yeltsin in a Russia on the verge of bankruptcy after defaulting on its debt the previous year. At the head of the country, Vladimir Putin set about bringing the oligarchs and mafia bosses to heel under the authority of one man, himself.
President Putin gets up and says, well, this corporate raiding is very bad for the Russian economy. We've got to do something about it.
The former KGB agents around the president put security services back into the heart of the Russian system via the FSB. The first target was the Yukos oil tanker. It was retrieved, and its owner, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, was sent to Siberia. Igor Sechin, a native of St. Petersburg and one of Vladimir Putin's closest friends, acquired Yukos for his own oil company, Rosneft. To finance the investments needed to exploit Siberian oil, Sechin needed access to international capital. The City of London, the world's leading financial center, opened its doors to him. Here, there was no need to certify the accuracy of financial accounts, and therefore no risk of criminal offense.
In the City of London, it's like that's sort of their raison d'etre. They're basically, you know, that's what do you think bankers do in the City of London? I mean, it's all about setting up and structuring entities that are basically opaque, and the most obvious and most frequent use of these entities is just for tax evasion.
In 2006, Rosneft was listed on the City Stock Exchange. It was the third biggest share sale in the world that year, a triumph. As oil prices soared, Russia became an El Dorado for oil companies, an El Dorado in the middle of the wilderness. In 2006, Andrei Kozlov, vice president of Russia's central bank, who had dismantled several money laundering networks and closed 44 banks, was murdered in Moscow, along with his driver. For the financial markets and investors, the mafia-like methods of the KGB oligarchy were of little importance. Oil money, even if it's Russian, has no smell. London, acting as Russia's money handler, was nicknamed Londongrad.
You've got a huge amount of property owned by Russians. You have law firms with so many lawyers helping facilitate Russian money laundering, Russian business. You've got PR firms that are working. You have a whole profession of facilitators. But some of these people serving this Russian elite are getting recognition from the British apparatus. You know, they're honored lawyers of the realm.
In the 2010s, 20 years after the historic meeting of the main criminal organizations in Yerevan, the transformation of Russia into a mafia state had facilitated commercial relations between various criminal actors established in all the strongholds of the global economy. This is when Paul Radu appeared on the scene, and with his OCCRP team, delved into the financial archives of the Soviet bloc over the last 3 decades. By scrutinizing the money movements of a Baltic bank, Paul Radu discovered a suspicious account used by various criminal organizations.
I was surprised. I said, what is this? This seems like a crazy conspiracy. One bank account, and you have all these criminal groups coming together to launder the money through this one Tormex limited company. This is insane. And then I looked a little bit more at those companies mentioned in the banking record, and there were always, you know, these offshore companies with bank accounts, sometimes in Latvia, sometimes in Estonia, sometimes in Germany, sometimes in the US, all over the world, China, everywhere. And they were, you know, transferring these huge amounts of money. And that's when, for the first time, we had access to direct banking records that showed that the conspiracy was on the side of the bankers who put the system together. And that's when we slowly started to understand what was going on.
With his colleagues at the OCCRP, Paul Radu then made a second discovery by tracking variations in the costs of money laundering in Europe and the former Soviet Union.
You look at the Italian mafias, you look at other groups, and they would have to give away quite a bit of their criminal profit to people who are professional money launderers. It was sometimes 10%, 15%, quite big chunks from the hard-earned criminal work, you know, from the crime. But bankers in the Baltics thought that there's opportunity in lowering the cost of money laundering. There's great opportunity in there. From the 10%, from the cut that was taken from money laundering, they went down to even 0.1%. But for the banker to make a profit, like a sizable profit, the banker needed volumes of money. There was a banker who set up the system and said, look, I have a bank and I have this pipeline for laundering billions. Now I only need the clients. Who wants to launder money? This is why you see multiple criminal groups laundering their money through the same pipelines. It's not that they know each other, but they make use of the same infrastructure that was put together in their service by the bankers.
Paul Radu conceptualized the pipeline, a hidden financial network set up by bankers, businessmen, and mafiosi. One after the other, the OCCRP would bring 3 cases of money laundering to light, revealing obscene amounts of misappropriated funds. The Troika Laundromat, the NGO, uncovered more than 47,000 financial transactions involving $26 billion of money laundered by 2,900 companies. The Azerbaijani Laundromat, an operation involving 4 UK-registered shell companies for people close to the government in Azerbaijan. And the Moldovan Laundromat, $20 billion, implicating 732 banks in 96 countries, among them Deutsche Bank, UBS, Bank of China, HSBC, the Royal Bank of Scotland, and Coutts & Co., the Bank of the British Crown.
Through OCCRP, we're able to connect those to what was going on in Western Europe, what was going on in the US, the United States, and elsewhere. So the whole thing is to understand these patterns, because at the end of the day, crime is a commodity. You have an import-export of crime. You have all this lot of money laundering, but you also have this mindset where criminals, when they find a criminal model that works, like the laundromats, be sure that they will apply that same model over and over and over again until someone stops them. If anyone is there to stop them, and usually there's nobody, because these are global structures, and at the global level, there's no natural enemy of organized crime and corruption. And this is the power of the criminals.
The work of the OCCRP marks a turning point in our understanding of contemporary financial crime. At the same time, other NGOs were tackling the world's criminal lung, tax havens. From 2013 onwards, a series of revelations known as the leaks revealed criminal financial practices directly involving states. Offshore Leaks, 2013, LuxLeaks, 2014, Swiss Leaks, 2015, Bahamas Leaks, 2016, Paradise Papers, 2017, Pandora Papers, 2021. John Christensen co-founded the Tax Justice Network, an NGO that documents the abuses of tax havens. Christensen was an insider in offshore finance on the island of Jersey for 14 years. This veteran of the fight against dirty money and tax havens sees the release of the first leaks as the reward for 20 years' work.
What the leaks have done is to show the banality of global corruption. Show that really boring people, bankers and accountants, are all involved in supporting corruption. They're all involved in a criminogenic environment. They pretend that they are ultra-respectable, professional people, whereas in reality, they are engaged in a long-term process of enabling and facilitating criminal activity and undermining democracy.
In 2013, a new leader came to power in China, Xi Jinping. At the same time, the offshore leaks came out, exposing the secret accounts of senior Chinese politicians and directors of major state-owned companies. Between 1,000 billion and 4,000 billion in untraceable assets have left China since the 2000s to invest in Caribbean tax havens, particularly the British Virgin Islands.
我们党面临着许多严峻挑战，党内存在着许多亟待解决的问题，尤其是一些党员干部中发生的贪污腐败、脱离群众、 形式主义。
Xi Jinping launched a vast anti-corruption campaign, but it only affected his rivals. The Chinese triads escaped the purges and were not dismantled. It was against this backdrop that a synthetic opiate appeared in Chinese laboratories, fentanyl. There is nothing illegal about its manufacture, but when added to heroin and cocaine, fentanyl multiplies the narcotic power by 100, making it a deadly poison. In 2013, the United States and Canada were already reporting thousands of deaths caused by the drug, which then had poorly understood supply networks. By 2021, the figure had risen to 100,000 deaths in the United States. Vancouver, the gateway to fentanyl on the North American continent, was setting new records, an exponential rise in the number of deaths, out-of-control property speculation, and a proliferation of gambling venues. The only difference was that the patrons of the system were no longer the triads.
Fentanyl is first and foremost a generator of proceeds for the state of China. They could shut those factories down if they wanted to. They could eradicate the precursors if they wanted to, if they were listening to the United States government. But they're not doing that. This is essentially what we can call the company, a network of triad bosses with interrelationships with Chinese security and intelligence and Chinese Communist Party handlers.
The international mafia facilitated a global division of labor. The chemicals needed to manufacture fentanyl were exported to Mexico by legal Chinese companies. The Sinaloa cartels, with links to the triads, are responsible for synthesizing them into narcotics. In this nebulous mafia network, a criminal group which didn't usually operate in these parts was spotted by the Canadian authorities.
Key people from the Sinaloa cartel arriving in Vancouver, and we can see that they would be meeting with agents of Hezbollah or Persian, Iranian, Middle Eastern high-level organized crime actors. Why would they be meeting together? This is a question that confounded Canadian investigators until they recognized that the Persian or Hezbollah actors were also very tightly connected with the Chinese triad networks. So why was that happening?
The appearance of Hezbollah, the Lebanese religious militia, in Vancouver reflects the need for its leaders to develop sophisticated financial engineering in order to conceal its criminal activities. Hezbollah's presence in Canada came as no surprise to U.S. intelligence, which keeps a close eye on its clandestine activities on the international stage. It all began a few years earlier. In 2006, the DEA, the U.S. anti-drug agency, was monitoring Colombia. A telephone tap was intercepted between members of the Medellin cartel and partners talking in Arabic.
We started hearing a lot of calls in Arabic all of a sudden and a lot of mentions of Hezbollah and money movements all around the world, including the Middle East and Africa.
Washington had become very involved in the Middle East since the invasion of Iraq and set up a task force. Jack Kelly, then a DEA agent, was called in. And Operation Cassandra began.
We knew that this was the beginning of a burgeoning relationship between this Medellin cartel and Hezbollah.
Hezbollah, weakened by Israel's war in Lebanon in 2006, began trafficking cocaine to the Middle East, Africa, and Europe using its networks within the Lebanese diaspora in Latin America.
It did look as though you had a Medellin drug lord sitting in a Hezbollah-controlled area of Lebanon, coordinating international cocaine trafficking. You could tell by the way the numbers contacted, who they were contacting, and who held the phones of those being contacted.
Phone taps and field investigations revealed another state actor, Venezuela. The president at the time, Hugo Chavez, developed close links with Hezbollah, Syria, and Iran through cocaine trafficking, money laundering, and arms trafficking, aimed at undermining American interests in the US, Latin America, and Iraq.
They began moving massive amounts of cash, mostly cocaine proceeds, on Máfias Airlines, the Venezuelan airlines, out of Caracas. And that airline then would go to Damascus and Tehran. And in Damascus, a lot of the money would be dropped off, and some of that money would make its way into Lebanon as part of this whole money laundering scheme.
America focused on Lebanon, where in just a few years, dollar reserves had doubled to $16 billion. David Asher supervised Operation Cassandra, along with the DEA, in his capacity as a senior advisor to the Special Operations Command within the Pentagon.
When we did Project Cassandra against Hezbollah, we systematically attacked their narcotics trafficking, money laundering enterprise.
Operation Cassandra traced the movements of large sums of money from the Lebanese Canadian Bank through exchange offices in Beirut.
I helped penetrate Lebanese Canadian Bank. We learned things that we had just no idea about. We learned that the Iranians had this massive amount of money inside that bank they were using to move money through Lebanon all over the world for their intelligence service and for their Quds Force, their terrorist organization.
In the space of a few months, Hezbollah transferred $5 billion to 249 accounts at Lebanese Canadian Bank. In 2011, the U.S. Treasury activated the 311 designation, a legal device that can prevent foreign banks from accessing U.S.-based banks. Overnight, the Lebanese Canadian Bank ceased to exist, but no criminal proceedings were initiated in the U.S.
The Lebanese gave us a spreadsheet where they showed us where all the money had gone for all these suspicious accounts tied to Hezbollah. Where they went to all the other banks. They gave us the names of the banks. They gave us the account numbers. They gave us all that. We did nothing with it as a government. So just merely to get to the point where we went after Lebanese Canadian Bank, it was so exhausting that, frankly, the Treasury Department, the Department of Justice, just called it a day.
For David Asher and Jack Kelly, the decision to drop criminal proceedings against Hezbollah after all their effort left a bitter taste. The reason may have been political. At the time, America was keen to avoid anything that might undermine the Iran nuclear deal, which was under negotiation. Between the risk of nuclear proliferation and the threat posed by one of the world's largest transnational criminal networks, Washington made a choice. A choice that left the Lebanese banks in the hands of mafia groups, leading to the country's present-day bankruptcy. A choice that also meant Canada was alone on the front lines against the growing number of criminal groups on its soil.
Androgeta, the Triads, Hezbollah, setting up operations in Canada because there's not a strong racketeering law.
In Vancouver in 2016, the amounts laundered from drug trafficking reached record levels. Nevertheless, Canadian authorities agreed to raise the betting threshold from $5,000 to $100,000 for a throw of the dice.
You know, when we account how much money has been laundered in Vancouver, we have to take the scale and multiply it from the billions in BC government casinos into the tens or even 100 billion in Vancouver real estate development, which is being driven largely especially in latter years, by the very same whale gamblers.
In this video shot in Vancouver and posted by a Canadian journalist, Beijing officials, intelligence service, and Triad members parade together for Chinese New Year.
So there's willful blindness from politicians. There's willful blindness from the bankers. At some level, many lawyers are willfully blind. Willful blindness.
In 2018, a resounding trial was held in Madrid against the Tambov Group, the St. Petersburg mafia group whose illicit activities in Spain included money laundering, drug trafficking, and arms dealing with complicity at the highest levels of the Russian state. Among the 17 accused, one man was on the run at the time of the trial, Gennady Petrov, one of the leaders of the Tambov Group and a former shareholder in Russia Bank. The Russia Bank, which was exposed by the Panama Papers, appeared to be the crown jewel of the Putin Empire.
Bank Russia is sometimes called Putin's bank. There's also all this inner circle of Putin's close friends that used the same bank for their money laundering, for looting state-owned companies in Russia. If you look at the universe of Russian banking, you see Banca Russia as being like a pillar of the system, but there were many other banks trying to do the same kind of business that Banca Russia did. And they were gradually shut down for money laundering, shut down for various fraud, for the corruption that these banks allowed. But Banca Russia was never touched.
We're taught that 1 + 1 = 2. Simple.
The Panama Papers also reveal one of the favorite destinations for the Russia Bank, the island of Cyprus. In Cyprus, a respectable financial center, it's not just banking institutions that host dirty money, but another key actor in the financial industry, major auditing and consulting firms.
Who's the Bank Russia's auditor? PwC. Who sets up all the companies in Cyprus for Bank Russia? PwC Consulting. Where are all the companies located for Bank Russia in Cyprus? In Nicosia and in Limassol, inside PwC's buildings. Okay, like that's not a secret. The people who really get protected are the accounting firms and the law firms. When's the last time a lawyer went to jail for providing services to a criminal?
A decade of leaks documented the major role Russia had played in laundering dirty money. And when the scandal at Danske Bank, Denmark's largest bank, broke in 2018, journalists could hardly believe the figures. Danske Bank had laundered $200 billion of Russian money from companies controlled by Vladimir Putin's family entourage and former KGB officers. According to the financial analysts and Bloomberg, Russian capital flight amounted to $330 billion between 2007 and 2014, and $390 billion between 2014 and 2020. But there was one troubling characteristic of this succession of leaks. The United States was never caught up in the whirlwind of revelations. Despite spearheading the fight against the world's dirty money, America allowed tax-free and opaque zones to flourish on its territory. The transparency imposed by Washington on the small tax havens of the Caribbean encouraged tax evaders to transfer their assets to places like Delaware, Nevada, South Dakota, Wyoming, and Florida. The world's financial enforcer had turned into the ultimate safe haven for dirty money.
There are a number of reasons why people from across the world might want to use the US. They are competent holding dollars. They can hide their identity. The US is particularly weak at sharing information. They can capture information about US citizens using offshore accounts through foreign banks. They will not share that information with countries elsewhere. And for that reason, foreign wealth holders who are wanting to use the US for all sorts of purposes, which might include tax evasion or hiding stolen assets or whatever, they are quite confident that they can hold their assets in the US and not have that information shared with the national tax authorities of the country where they're resident.
The United States had another problem in its hunt for dirty money. After 25 years of budget cuts, the power of the once mighty IRS had been severely reduced. The IRS had fewer agents than in 1945. The result of the agency's controlled demolition was the loss of $600 billion a year in revenue, the equivalent of the U.S. military budget. A third of the total tax loss was attributable to the richest 1%.
And this might be a moment of truth where Europe and the United States finally have to confront their demons, which is this horrible convergence of interests between kleptocrats, organized crime, and the economic interests of domestic political and economic elites. And this alignment of interests has completely undermined the fundamentals of a market economy, undermined rule of law, undermined democracy itself.
The war in Ukraine closes a chapter opened in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Economic and financial sanctions imposed on Russia, the most drastic ever imposed on a country, lay down a clear path in the global fight against dirty money pipelines. More and more activists, investigative journalists, academics, judges, and whistleblowers are rallying to this cause and speaking out. They help show that while organized crime is the most violent form of capitalism, it is the tools put in place by the facilitators, investment bankers, tax lawyers, consultants, legislators, that amplify its brutality manyfold and ultimately lead to war. Mafias and banks, the story of two worlds seemingly pitted against each other, and of two worlds that could not help but meet.